So, as you know from the schedule that you have in the book in front of you, we've got a pretty tight schedule. So in order to stay on schedule, I want us to think about the near future, and that is in the near future, about an hour from now, you're all going to be having coffee. But between now and then, what I'd like to do is change your life. So I'll see if I can accomplish that in the next 60 minutes. So let me see if I can step out of this presentation and enter into the notes that you have in front of you. So this presentation, as soon as it comes up, is what I call the Functional Inflammology Protocol. And we're going to divide this into two sections. Like I said, we can all look forward to having coffee in about an hour and 10 minutes or so. And I'll try to get through this first section in about an hour. And it's from here that I'll begin to kind of express and give you the model of this new clinical tool that I've developed over the last 2 years. At least in its current form. Of course, I worked on it before then for many years. But as you see it now, this is only about the past year and a half because I completely revised things in March of last year. Speaking of function and speaking of personalization, I usually speak better if I don't wear a tie, so at some point I'll probably take my tie off and probably my jacket as well. How many of you have ever seen me wear a tie? This is the first time. So let's not let it last much longer. And what I'll try to do also, and I think this is important, it'll probably cost me 45 seconds or a minute, but I'd like to take a chance and do something here. What I'm going to invite you to do is try to memorize the things that we're talking about right now, not simply understand them conceptually and then refer back to the notes. One of the things I try to emphasize in education is what we call declarative knowledge, right? So knowledge that you can use is only knowledge that you know and can declare without being prompted, right? And when we're working with patients, we don't have time to go back and look at notes all the time. So I'd like to invite you to challenge yourself and accept the fact that you can learn this material, and you're going to see how easy it is because I've certainly made some creative efforts to make it easy. So in the interest of honoring my right hemisphere, which has been a little dormant for the past 8 months, I'd like to tell you one of my favorite poems from Rumi, who is considered one of the most famous poets of the Muslims. I think he lived from 1207 to 1273. So he says, my poems resemble the bread of Egypt. One night passes over them and you can't eat them anymore. So gobble them up while they're still fresh before the dust of the world settles on them. Where a poem belongs is here in the warmth of the chest. Out in the world it dies of cold. You've seen a fish. Put him on dry land. He quivers for a few minutes and then he's still. And even if you eat these poems while they're still fresh, you still have to bring forward many images yourself. Actually, my friend, what you're eating is your own imagination. These poems are not just a bunch of old proverbs. So part of what that means to me, where he says, where a poem belongs is here in the warmth of the chest, is that we have to commit ourselves to memorizing those things that we love, whether it's poetry or clinical protocols, so that we can apply them in real time, which is ultimately, our life and our existence. So you've got my disclosures and learning objectives in the notes. We'll skip through a few of these provisional slides. And I'd like to show you a case that we're going to talk about several times throughout today. This is a case of a woman she was the first patient who I started to use the new functional inflammology protocol on last year. You can see this is March of last year, 2012, and that's when I first updated the protocol. So she came in with a severe case of drug-resistant rheumatoid arthritis. She was an excellent case. She had done a 26-day water-only fast in an effort to cure herself of this condition with no good results, but that showed me that she was committed, obviously. 26-day water-only fast. So when she first came in, her CCP antibodies, which is the main marker that we use to monitor rheumatoid arthritis these days, was greater than 250, meaning it couldn't even be measured to its true value. It was at the limit of the laboratory. So she followed the same protocol that we're about to go through right now. And about 9 months later, in January of this year, her CCP antibodies were reduced to 195. And she was not quite asymptomatic, but she was certainly out of the firestorm of inflammation she had been in before. And what I'll tell you this afternoon in the presentation is I modified her treatment plan in January, and then just 3 months later, her antibodies went from 195 down to 54. So this is not simply inducing regression or remission of the disease. This is inducing reversal of the disease, right? She's increasingly asymptomatic. Her laboratory values have now entered into what we could consider the high normal range. But that's the power of the protocol that we're going to start going through right now. You've got my introduction, your handouts, so we won't spend time on it right now. I've published, obviously, some books and articles along the way. So again, my goal is to share with you this new protocol and the way I've designed it. It's easy to apply, and it's impressively easy to memorize. So again, the goals are to identify the major factors, just like we had said before. You know, out of the tens of thousands of factors we have to consider, we have to pick the ones that are most relevant in most cases and apply those. It doesn't mean we're excluding other things necessarily, but it does mean, as I said before, we all have to start with a scheme or a structure of behavior, and we have to start with things that we can actually work with in real time. So we will work on identifying those. We'll work on reciting a mnemonic, which I think you'll find very easy, and then we'll explain and implement this. Because as we all know, we can take all of this scientific and intellectual knowledge, but if we can't distill it down to an 8th grade level for our patients, it could be lost on them. They have to be able to apply what we know. It doesn't mean they have to know everything we know, because we can't explain nutrigenomics and epigenetics, detoxification pathways, etc. But we can help them understand why we're doing what we're doing. And I'd like for you to, at least at this point, before we break for coffee, be able to recite what the components are. As we all know, medical education is nutritionally deficient and therefore drug dependent. One of the hospitals I trained in actually had a McDonald's in the lobby. And then when I was doing family medicine, we advocated fresh vegetables in the posters, but then we served our people fried food and soft drinks. So that's not simply denying them good nutrition, it's denying them a cohesive reality, because we have posters advocating vegetables and we're serving fried foods and soft drinks. It doesn't have to be that way. The same month that other photo was taken from the hospital I was working in, I also went to Colombia and spent some time in a hospital there, and this is what they serve their patients. Steamed vegetables, fresh fruit and vegetable puree, healthy serving of protein. So why does hospital food in other countries look like this, and in America it looks like this? Everything we're going to talk about today will certainly be founded upon what we call evidence-based medicine. And I've given you the components of that. This is an interesting article published in a British Medical Journal in 1999 showing that the way doctors are trained to think, and those of us who have been through medical school know this because it's true, we're taught to focus on the diagnosis and the appropriate drug, but never thinking outside of that box. You know, what if this patient's condition is mitochondrial dysfunction or dysbiosis? That never crosses our, clinical intellectual horizon, so of course it doesn't get implemented. You've seen the functional medicine matrix, and so part of what that allows us to do is decipher these complex illnesses so that we can actually get a handle on them, or ultimately take the pathophysiologic bull by the horn, so to speak. Right? Because if a patient comes in and they just have a stamp on their forehead that says they've been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, what do we do with that? I think we'd all be somewhat paralyzed to be confronted with that diagnosis unless we could start to break it down. Okay, well, what are the components of rheumatoid arthritis? What are the components of hypertension? What are the components of migraine? So as Jeff and I were talking last night, part of what I do, part of what Jeff does, part of what those of us who teach and lecture and write books do, is we look at thousands of articles. And based on looking at thousands of articles, what we can do is recognize patterns in the research. And so the components that we're going to talk about today of the protocol represent those major patterns. So it's not simply one article here or another article here. We look at thousands of articles. Like last year, I consider to have been a slow year for me in terms of reading research because I was very busy with administrative tasks. But I still, when I went back and looked at the new articles, I had either read, reread, highlighted, or downloaded, it was 1,200 articles. That's about 100 articles a month, in addition to emails, teaching, other conversations, giving lectures, attending lectures. So it's just a massive amount of data. And based on that, we're able to do pattern recognition, and that's what you'll see today. So the task is to learn a new approach, and I'll show you this protocol. So my favorite topic, I suppose among many favorite topics, is inflammation. And so when I talk about inflammation, I divide it down into these three categories of inflammation, one of which I call metabolic inflammation, such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. Another I call allergic inflammation. We all know that. Atopic dermatitis, allergies, asthma. And then autoimmune inflammation, which happens to be my area of clinical focus. So in my clinical practice, I only see autoimmune diseases. And then I was about to say the nice thing, but it's not nice for the patients. But the tricky thing or the complicated thing about that is a lot of times when patients come in with rheumatoid arthritis, they also have insulin resistance, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, vasculitis, other things that have to be managed as well. Here again is the functional medicine matrix. This was the version of about 10 years ago, which I designed for IFM at that time. So we're going to go through some acronyms now, one of which you've all learned, most of you who are clinicians, called SOAP, which stands for Subjective Objective Assessment and Plan. We all learn that in medical school, regardless of which school we go to. And that's a way, again, of creating some structure so that then we can proceed in our clinical experience with some degree of organization. So we take a subjective history, we do an objective physical exam, we look at lab tests, we put all that together in an assessment or diagnosis, and then we make a plan. So SOAP notes are kind of the professional standard for clinical management. I also created this one last year called DIRT, which is about risk management. So it stands for defensive mindset, limiting the duration of treatment. For example, is giving someone 300,000 units of vitamin A a reasonable thing to do? Absolutely. Is giving them 300,000 units of vitamin A for 4 years without supervision reasonable? Absolutely not. So a lot of times we do reasonable things, but part of what makes it reasonable is limiting the duration. We look for interactions with drugs and diseases. I've given you some examples there. I think it's always appropriate for us to ask ourselves if we need to refer this patient or when do we need to reschedule their next visit, their return visit. And then with the treatment plan, we sign it, date it, chart it, make sure that the patient gets a copy as well. So that's DIRT. Duration of treatment, interactions, referral, and return visit written into the treatment plan. So with that introduction, we will now get into the first part of the protocol, what we're going to cover before our coffee break, which is food. So on this slide, you see what I appreciate as the major patterns and trends in the research. So as we all know, and as Jeff said before, we all know and we've all heard it a million times that all diseases have a genetic predisposition. But as Jeff said before, predisposition doesn't mean the same thing as cause. Now, certain diseases, of course, have a one-to-one correlation, but those are rare conditions. So in this model, I tend, through my creative license, I suppose, I tend to ignore the role of genetics because from a practical, hands-on clinical standpoint, what am I going to do about someone's genes other than if they have an identified disorder, I can try to manage that, but I can't change that. So what I'm looking for in my clinical protocols are things that are actionable. And genes, now I can modify genetic expression with diet, nutrition, botanical medicines, etc. So I'm not disregarding the role of genes, but I'm putting genes a little bit on the sideline, so to speak, so I can focus on things that I can change. Well, like number one, I can change someone's diet, or at least I can advocate to change their diet. Number two is microbe-induced inflammation. Number three is this whole thing about inflammatory phenotype balance. So we all know that our immune system is made up of different cell populations. What many people don't know is you can actually change those populations of immune cells in real time in adults simply by using nutritional supplementation. I'll show you that. Mitochondrial dysfunction is a really important topic. We have all day on Friday committed to that. Stress, psychology, sociology, lifestyle, sleep, spinal health, sweat, stress reduction, etc. Hormonal imbalances, xenobiotic exposure. These were the things that were starting to kind of cluster together in my research and literature reviews, and I was seeing these as the major factors. So I started to organize them. It's like, okay, what do I do clinically? Well, I always talk about diet, And then I focus a lot on dysbiosis. And then I was into this idea about initiating an inflammatory balance by changing the immune phenotypes. And then mitochondrial dysfunction came in. So I just started to kind of organize those in a way that I felt like was reflective of my clinical practice. Again, you'll see that this protocol is applicable to disorders of so-called chronic inflammation. So I know that Jeff mentioned that term earlier. I know we've all heard it and we've all learned that term. So now that we've spent enough time with the term chronic inflammation, let's get rid of it. So one of the things I'll propose to you here is that chronic inflammation doesn't exist. If we say chronic inflammation, what we're implying is that the inflammation has a life of its own and it's just going to be there forever. But is that really true? I mean, does the body engage in self-destructive behaviors without cause? I'd say probably not. So rather than calling this chronic inflammation, let's just change the word slightly and let's call it sustained inflammation. So this goes back to philosophy and psychology, right? If we believe in a cause and effect universe, then we have to believe that if there's an effect, there was a cause. And so we could apply that to inflammation by saying, if someone has a sustained state of inflammation, what are the contributors to that? And then we would take on the intellectual task of, rather than being passive about it and saying, well, it's just idiopathic, which means we haven't asked the right question, why don't we go ahead and ask the right question, which is, what would be the major contributors to a state of sustained inflammation? Very, very applicable to insulin resistance, which, as Jeff said, is now one of the epidemics. Insulin resistance should be an orphan disease, not an epidemic. How do we manage that medically? As Jeff said, we simply throw a metabolic monkey wrench into the system, and we see certain parameters change, and we call that effective treatment. Now, I think we all respect the fact that that does have a role. If you have a patient in the emergency room with their blood pressure of 250 over 190, right? The time has come for medications. I think we all appreciate that. In that case, we'd probably use intravenous hydralazine. 10 milligrams every 20 minutes or so. But this acute care model, as applied to chronic disease management or sustained disease management, I think we'd all agree is kind of an outdated concept. Does it have a role? Sure, in some cases, or as co-management. But if all we do is rely on medications to suppress the manifestations of dysfunction and disease, the patients will be stuck in a pattern of dysfunction and disease for the rest of their lives because they'll be drug dependent at that time. Same thing with insulin resistance, like we've touched on before. How do we treat that medically? We start with metformin, we go to the sulfonylureas, we go to the TZD drugs, we add a few other new drugs, always new drugs on the market, and then we hit them with some insulin. You'll see that most of these drugs carry major side effects. One of the ones from a nutritional standpoint that you should all be aware of is the fact that metformin causes B12 malabsorption. And so a lot of these patients with peripheral neuropathy attributed to their diabetes actually have a B12 deficiency neuropathy. And that's very well represented in the research. So this protocol is also applicable to allergy and my favorite conditions, autoimmunity. How do we treat autoimmunity from a medical or pharmacologic standpoint? NSAIDs, aspirin, acetaminophen, prednisone, methotrexate, sulfasalazine, hydroxychloroquine, biologics, stem cell transplant. Of course, we'll always have new experimental drugs that patients can try. But when we look at the long-term outcome of patients treated as such with that protocol, which is the standard protocol, we see that it only results in about a 10% sustained remission over the course of 2 years. Now, that protocol that was on the previous slide costs about $50,000, maybe more per year. I had one patient several years ago when I was still in Texas who was an 18-year-old girl with psoriasis, and she was being treated with the biologics for her psoriasis, but since her family didn't have insurance, they were having to pay out of pocket. And so the mother of this young girl was having to work 2 jobs, and they had to mortgage their house in order to pay for these drugs, which were costing them $80,000 per year. Well, I'm sure you've all seen, and certainly I've seen in my own clinical practice, cases of psoriasis that are completely cleared in 1 month just with simple nutritional interventions. And that's the protocol that we'll talk about right now. Again, what do we learn in medical school? We diagnose and we drug. And that's considered optimal therapy. That's the standard of care. It's the standard of care that we're held to. So if we deviate from that, we could have professional liability or lose prescription rights or standing in certain organizations like clinics and hospitals. So medical doctors in a lot of settings are really forced to practice this way. Even if they want to practice differently, they can't. Americans, as you already know, take more drugs than any society anywhere in the world ever in history. And this was published probably this was a newspaper article published probably about 15 years ago. But look at the trend. This was published just earlier this year, showing that, again, in April of 2013, more than 4 billion prescriptions were written in 2011. That's the most ever. So this trend of the medicalization of dysfunctional physiologic status is stronger than ever because people are taking more drugs than they ever have. Obviously, we need to initiate some change there. America spends $60 billion per week on healthcare. Part of the reason is there's an incentive for bad healthcare. It's called money. If you look at this article that was published in April of this year, this revealed that hospitals actually make more money when their patients suffer from complications. So they're de-incentivized to provide good care. So diseases are understandable as opposed to idiopathic. Rather than relying on drugs, we can correct these fundamental imbalances. And these patients do need a multifaceted approach. So this is a diagram which you have on the cover of your notebook. And you have the updated version. This actually came from a textbook I wrote back in 2006 called Integrative Rheumatology. And at that time, I had 5 components that I thought were leading to immune activation. Since then, of course, I've added 2 for a total of 7. We're going to go through and introduce those right now. And then we'll take a break for the coffee that we all love, but none of us admit it. But I admit it. I'm looking forward to it. So, 7 modifiable mechanisms: diet, dysbiosis, nutritional immunomodulation, mitochondrial dysfunction, psychoneuroimmunology and sociology, hormonal imbalance, and xenobiotic immunotoxicity. So these were the things I was wrestling with last year as I was reorganizing my slides, and I thought, wow, those are the 7 patterns I see in the research. What can we do clinically, or what can I do as a writer and educator to make that easier to understand? So we all love acronyms. So I was working on this and working on it, and this was my list, and I thought, what can I do with this list to make an acronym that people can actually apply clinically, right? And this took me a long time, believe it or not. The answer might seem rather apparent now, but everything's obvious in retrospect. So I was working this, and actually the first acronym I came up with was FIND SET, with T standing for toxins. And I thought that's pretty good because you're trying to find a set of problems and solutions. And then, you can always say X for xenobiotics. So that's the way that it became. So with that acronym, again, just like we use SOAP, Subjective Objective Assessment and Plan, we could use this, and you probably don't want to use the first version of it, but you could use the second version in your chart notes, FIND-SET, and this will walk you through food, infections, nutritional immunomodulation, which is balancing immune phenotypes, dysfunctional mitochondria, stress, endocrine, and then either toxins or xenobiotics. So we're going to start with the first of those, and then we'll take a break for coffee. We're going to talk about food first. I think all of us who are here focus on food when we work with our clients, because, could we even think of a condition that doesn't have a dietary or nutritional component, or that isn't dietarily or nutritionally responsive? I don't even know if such a condition exists. So I always start with food, and then in my practice of working mostly with autoimmune patients, I focus on infection and dysbiosis, and we'll just take it from there. Again, this is what your chart note could look like. SOAP, and then just remind yourself with FIND-SET for food, infections, nutritional immunomodulation, dysfunctional mitochondria, stress, endocrine imbalances, and toxic exposures and accumulation. How many of your patients have some level of toxic accumulation, whether it's heavy metals or xenobiotics? What percentage? All of them, right? How many of you have some level of toxic exposure or accumulation, right? All of us. So this isn't some abstract thing that you're going to do with one patient out of 100. This has relevance for every patient you see and your favorite patient, which is probably you, right? Because we all have to take care of ourselves, and we all need to not only preserve our own health and well-being so that we can then perform well in our other capacities, but the other component of that is this word that doesn't get a lot of attention these days, and that is just integrity. If we're going to tell our patients how to do this, I think we should be doing it ourselves. And the other thing is, once you do it yourself, then it becomes easier to memorize and apply it to your patients, because you will already know what it's like to take those supplements that you don't want to take, or get up and have a smoothie instead of grabbing junk food on the way to work. So I think it builds empathy when you've actually lived it. So all of our patients come to us and they need to know what to eat. So what I've done, and I published this in 2011, is I put together a dietary plan, which you're going to look at right here. And this is what I call the supplemented paleo-Mediterranean diet. So obviously Lauren Cordain's coming on Saturday, and he's the modern father of the paleo diet in terms of its popularization and publication for sure. So what is the paleo diet? And how do you explain to your patients what to eat if you're going to advocate a paleo diet? So the way that I say it is it's fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, berries, and lean sources of protein. You'll notice that excludes pasta, bagels, junk food, food additives, processed foods. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, berries, lean sources of protein. And then your patients will say, well, can I have pasta, pizza, Wonder Bread, bagels, donuts? And your answer could be whatever you want it to be. But you could say, when you grow that in your own backyard organically, you can pull that bagel off of the bagel tree and have one at any time that's convenient for you. Otherwise, I would like for you to eat fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, berries, and lean sources of protein. Now, another question that I often get asked is, well, how strict do people have to be with that dietary plan? The strictness of the plan is proportional to two things. One is the severity of illness. So people who are very sick need to be more strict with the diet. You would all expect that. And the other answer is, how healthy do people want to be? That is the most scientific, most nutrient-dense, most low-antigenic, beneficial diet that exists. Now, we can talk about nuances of that. So when I say that, just to dispel a little bit of controversy, which probably already got stirred by my statement, I'm talking about mostly a plant-based diet. We moderate carbohydrate intake per need, and we moderate protein intake per need. But it's still a diet of fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, berries, lean sources of protein. So that's paleo diet. I call it paleo-Mediterranean because then that justifies dark chocolate, red wine, and olive oil. Right? We got to live a little bit. Multivitamin deficiencies and mineral deficiencies are very common, so I supplement their foundational diet with a multivitamin, multimineral. A lot of times people need some extra vitamin D. The prevalence of vitamin D deficiency, if we define it properly by physiologic need, probably in the 90%, especially up here in the Northwest. But even if you look at studies, like I did a study in Texas, other studies in Arizona and Florida, find the prevalence of vitamin D deficiency to be usually certainly above 70%, usually 80, 90%. So I did a study when I was in my last year of medical school in Texas, and we looked at vitamin D levels in 157 rheumatic patients in a rheumatology clinic. And out of those 157, 156 were deficient. Well, what's the relevance of that? The relevance of that is incredible in the treatment of autoimmune diseases, because you're going to find out in a few moments, if you haven't heard it before, that vitamin D is one of the ways that we induce tolerance in the immune system. How long does it take? 1 month. Who can we do that in? Anybody. Healthy controls, MS, and lupus patients is where it's been studied so far. So that's real-time epigenetic modification of inflammatory phenotype. So there's almost no such thing as not being allergic to wheat from an immunologic standpoint. Foods that promote bacterial overgrowth, again, wheat and dairy, potatoes. Dysbiosis, not enough exercise, toxin accumulation, emotional stress, and toxic relationships. So we try to get people off of their Western lifestyle, which promotes inflammation, onto a wellness lifestyle, which is anti-inflammatory. These are the components of the American diet, which I just touched on. Too many grains, especially wheat, simple carbohydrates, lack of fruit. So lack of fruit and vegetables translates into lack of phytonutrients. Lack of phytonutrients translates into lack of antioxidant protection as well as anti-inflammatory protection. Generally speaking, if we look at the pattern of response induced by phytonutrients, it's anti-inflammatory and antioxidant. And those things obviously go hand in hand because oxidative stress triggers inflammatory pathways trigger oxidative stress. So people can get into a sustained cycle of oxidative stress and inflammation based on dietary indiscretion. One thing I want to make sure that I touch on here, which again is kind of a different version of the same list and concept. Let's look at number 7, which we were just talking about at dinner last night. So what changed my reality with regard to alkalinization was a paper that was published in 2004 by a lead author whose last name is Proudfoot. And you can Google this article very easily and find it. So the lead author's name was Proudfoot. This was 2004, Journal of Toxicology and Clinical Toxicology. And the title of this article was A Position Paper on Urinary Alkalinization. This was an internationally endorsed article promoting the use of urinary alkalinization in patients who had been acutely poisoned, like in an emergency room setting. Well, if urinary alkalinization is so important that it warrants an internationally endorsed position paper for patients who have been toxically exposed, couldn't we apply a version of that through lifestyle to help our patients detoxify when they're exposed to chemicals every day? Seems like we could. So that's where I became more convinced of the importance of urinary alkalinization. And as time permits, I can certainly explain more detail. Urinary alkalinization, which defined here as a urine pH of 7.5, induces many potent, powerful, and pretty irreplaceable benefits. So it needs to be a major goal. How do you measure that? Just use urine pH paper. But if you can get people to a urine pH of 7.5, most of your patients are probably at 5.5. If you can get them slightly alkaline, numerous benefits occur. I'll go ahead and tell you what those benefits are. It's not in your notes, but it's easy to memorize, especially if you're kinesthetic, because then you can use your hand to cue you. So when people become slightly alkaline from being acidic, which most of your patients are, let's focus on 4 things that change just by changing their pH. So something goes up, endorphin levels go up. So when people are slightly alkaline, they produce more endogenous endorphins. Okay, well, what's the effect of that? They feel better, have more energy, and they have less pain. And according to one study in cigarette smokers, they're able to reduce their nicotine intake. So it has an anti-addictive effect, which we could probably extrapolate to social behavior in general. But let's just say for now, when people become alkaline, their endorphin levels raise, so they feel better, function better, require less medication, and are less addictive. The other thing that raises is intracellular magnesium levels. So simply by making people more alkaline, we can raise their intracellular magnesium, as well as promote renal retention of magnesium, by 11%. So your patients will develop better magnesium status or better magnesium nutriture simply by a pH change, without giving them a magnesium supplement. Now, obviously, if you make them more alkaline and give them a magnesium supplement, you'll see even greater benefit, because usually nutritional intake of magnesium is insufficient. So that's what goes up. Intracellular magnesium goes up, endorphins go up. What goes down is serum cortisol levels. So cortisol levels go down when people are more alkaline. Now, shifting our direction from vertical to horizontal. So endorphins and magnesium go up, cortisol goes down, toxins go out, and nutrients stay in. So alkalinization promotes renal retention of potassium, calcium, and magnesium. So you see Those are all clinically significant benefits we can get just by changing someone's pH. So again, let's finish up the conversation about diet. So you've already gotten the take-home message. What should people eat? I call it the supplemented paleo-Mediterranean diet. Paleo diet is the most nutrient-dense, lowest calorie, and one of the themes you're going to hear on every day of this conference is the importance of low carbohydrate intake. We've all been, I'm going to say this two different ways. We've all been taught, but basically we've been mistaught to rely on carbohydrates, right? And that comes from our biochemistry education. We're all taught in Biochem 101 that you start with glucose, it goes down glycolysis, this is my visual diagram because I used to have to memorize this and draw it out. We start with glycolysis, we go through the pyruvate dehydrogenase shuttle or complex, we go through the Krebs cycle, and then we go along the bottom, which is the electron transport chain, right? That's what we're all taught, meaning that ATP, that's what we're taught, but the take-home message from that is that to end up with ATP, we have to start with glucose, right? That's what we're taught, and that's wrong. What the research shows is that high levels of carbohydrate consumption actually impair mitochondrial function, and that's true of all carbohydrates, which ultimately become glucose-based, but it's especially true of fructose. The conversion of fructose, just to nail down the biochemistry of this, the conversion of fructose into fructose 1-phosphate requires ATP. It doesn't give ATP, it requires ATP. So overconsumption of dietary fructose, high fructose corn syrup for example, costs ATP from the cell, and that's why it induces this pro-inflammatory response. So this study published back in 2004 showed that fast food consumption caused an inflammatory response that lasted for about 2 hours. Other studies have shown 3 hours, 4 hours. Okay, so what's the take-home message of this study? Junk food diets cause inflammation that's sustained for a couple of hours. Well, what if people are having junk food for breakfast, and then they have their mid-morning crash, so they go for some more junk food, mostly sugar and phytonutrient deprived foods, which would otherwise offset the inflammatory and oxidative tendency. And then let's say they go for a pro-inflammatory lunch, and they have another pro-inflammatory snack in the afternoon, and they have a pro-inflammatory dinner. They can have sustained inflammation throughout the day just based on poor dietary choices. In this case, it was a hash brown, eggs, and sausage muffin. In America, approximately 21%, I believe, we'll see this on one of the upcoming slides. Actually, it's this slide. Approximately 21% of food consumed in America is fast food. So that dietary inflammatory response that I just outlined, that's happening to people at least 21% of the time because that is the fast food diet and the fast food culture that surrounds us. When people consume simple sugars, that also induces free radical damage, and anytime we have more free radicals being produced, we induce antioxidant nutrient depletion. So when people consume sugar, simple sugars, and that can include fruit juice, they get oxidative stress, antioxidant nutrient depletion, and according to this study, which has been replicated, this has been published twice by 2 different groups, they also get immune suppression. So when people eat junk food, when they eat sugar, when they eat processed foods, convenience foods, they're ultimately physiologically inconvenienced by the oxidative and inflammatory and immune suppressing effects that result. So, I think the more knowledge you have and the more knowledge we have, the more we're able to apply this clinically, because we have to ultimately break down our rationale for why we're doing things, and we have to explain that to patients, right? It's not enough, usually, just to tell patients to go home and change their diet and lifestyle, right? We have to convince them, or, as Nietzsche would say, we have to seduce or elevate people to the changes we want them to make. Really nice article here, published in 2003, talking about phytonutrient synergism. So, we can talk about certain dietary supplements, and we will talk about those, of course, as we go through the course of the week. But We also need to look at phytonutrient synergism. How many phytonutrients have been discovered? Probably about 8,000, most of which, if you look at the pattern, they're antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. So we need our patients to consume them. No supplement will ever exist that contains all 8,000, even though some helpful supplements are certainly available. But we need to have our patients consume the richest source of phytonutrients, which is what? Fruits, vegetables, plant seeds, and berries. Many foods, and one of my vegetables of choice, which is carrots, going back to this slide, a lot of plants contain toxins that actually stimulate an adaptive response in the human consumer. One of my favorite foods, which might be listed on here, is the antimicrobial effects of certain foods. Garlic, berberine we'll talk about, but also carrots. If you look in standard medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine back in the 1920s and 1930s, they advocated the use of carrot soup for the treatment of chronic infectious diarrhea. And that's because carrots uniquely have an antimicrobial effect. That's relevant for your patients with dysbiosis of the GI tract. Eventually, we want to help clear out and reduce their bacterial load, which we'll talk about throughout the conference. So we talked a little bit about insulin resistance. So insulin stimulates lipogenesis or adipogenesis, which basically just means the formation of more fat. What that ultimately results, though, what it results in is the accumulation of a specific fatty acid, among others, but let's just focus on this one right now, called ceramide. When insulin levels are high, the body produces more ceramide. Okay, I'm going to rewind that one more time. When glucose levels are high, insulin levels become high. When insulin becomes high, the body produces more ceramide. The effect that ceramide has is to produce insulin resistance. So we've all been taught and told through ads and research that insulin resistance is bad. Well, and I think we appreciated that it is bad as a complex phenomenon, but here's my point. Insulin resistance, as you already know, doesn't cause itself. Insulin resistance, at least in part, is a self-protective mechanism whereby cells are trying to protect themselves from fuel overload. Remember what I said a minute ago, how glucose causes free radical damage and inflammation? Well, the cells know that. So when glucose levels are very high, the cells try to protect themselves by becoming insulin resistant. One of the mediators of insulin resistance is ceramide. And that's how we enter into this vicious cycle of hyperinsulinemia. A lot of times these patients are treated with more insulin. So it just creates this vicious cycle of additional insulin resistance. Now, there are other causes of insulin resistance as well. Chronic sustained inflammation due to microbial infections. Can we treat that? Absolutely. So that's a variable we can control. What about nutritional deficiencies as a cause of insulin resistance? Can we treat that? What about sarcopenia, not enough muscle mass, not enough exercise stimulation of the GLUT4 receptors, things like that? So if you look at insulin resistance as a complex phenomenon and then begin to decipher that phenomenon, you'll see that there are many of the components we can address through diet, lifestyle, exercise, nutritional supplementation. Oh, the other component that's well established now to contribute to insulin resistance is xenobiotic exposure. So if you look at people who are insulin resistant, for example, and this has been published several times, so I think we can believe it to be reliable. If you look at people who are overweight, they're not all insulin resistant. The people who are insulin resistant, often it's independent of weight, but it's more strongly correlated with total xenobiotic load, which is total toxin load. Persistent organic pollutants are a major cause of insulin resistance. I'll skip over this one to the extent that I can, but let me just say this since we're on the slide already. You're going to hear these words throughout the conference. Inflammasome, as Jeff already mentioned. What is the inflammasome? And the inflammasome is kind of an enzyme complex. This is one way to understand it. Inflammasome is an enzyme complex that transforms inflammatory cytokine precursors into their active form. So for a cytokine to become an effector cytokine in its inflammatory phenotype, we might say, it has to get converted from a precursor to its active form. That's what we call the inflammasome. Well, then the question we could ask is, well, what activates the inflammasome? And as you can see here, It's obesity-related cellular stress or danger-associated molecular patterns and pathogen-associated molecular patterns. So the combination of fuel overload and microbial infections, those are the main triggers of the inflammasome. Inflammasome is what processes cytokines to be inflammatory. So again, we're just trying to deconstruct and decipher these phenomena that we've all heard of. We all have seen inflammatory diseases. If we've looked at the research lately, we've all heard this word inflammasome. Well, okay, let's go back, as I just did, a step ahead of that and ask, okay, well, what activates the inflammasome? If all we do is focus on inflammation over here without looking upstream, then we have nothing to do other than focus on this terminal process. But if we rewind the tape, unpeel the onion, turn the pages of the book back, whatever metaphor we want to use, if we ask, okay, well, if inflammation is the problem, what's the cause of the inflammation? Okay, if inflammasome activation is what causes inflammation, along with Nf Kappa-B and a lot of other things, what activates that? And then what activates that? And then why did that get set up? So, let's talk about wheat. Here are 8 reasons to not eat wheat. And by the way, your lunch on Friday is completely gluten-free, as you would expect. Wheat is nutrient poor. It's phytonutrient poor. Celiac disease is common, now identified as 1 in 141 per 141 people in the US. Wheat allergies, which is different from celiac disease, is also common. Wheat triggers a lot of very odd problems. You're going to hear Tom O'Brien talk about this tomorrow, such as gluten ataxia, dermatitis herpetiformis, a lot of immune complex-mediated conditions. Because, as point number 6 says, even non-allergic, non-celiac patients, when they consume wheat, they form immune complexes. So you're going to hear the theme of immune complexes in a few of my presentations, so I'll just explain what that means now. And I usually have to use a model of some object or other. So immune complexes are combinations of antigens and antibodies. So let's say somebody eats wheat and it has an antigen in it, and then their body forms an antibody which attaches onto that. Well, as you may know from physiology, all antibodies have 2 heads on them. So what you can end up with is a chain of antigen, antibody, antigen, antibody. It's a long chain of antigens and antibodies, and that's what an immune complex is. The relevance of that is that immune complexes are a component of virtually every autoimmune disease out there. So anytime we're working with chronic inflammation or so-called chronic sustained autoimmunity, we have to think of what's the source of antigens and what's causing this immune trigger. High fermentation, another concept that you'll see mentioned throughout my presentations, is not simply dysbiosis, but a subtype of gastrointestinal dysbiosis called small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. You're going to see that in a lot of patients, and especially some subpopulations. Rheumatoid arthritis, 40% of those patients have bacterial overgrowth. Fibromyalgia, what percentage? 100%. And I've got some videos on YouTube that discuss that more. But you're going to see that's a major component. We'll talk about it this afternoon. Wheat is also inherently pro-inflammatory. So again, regardless of allergy, family history, it is inherently pro-inflammatory. It activates Nf Kappa-B, certain proteins. Wheat causes inflammation, as you can see from this open access article. So I'll just read the last sentence that's highlighted here. Gluten might play a key role in the pathogenesis of autoimmune and inflammatory disorders and some malignant diseases. Wheat promotes bacterial overgrowth, as I say here. Low carbohydrate diets have been shown to reduce inflammation. So how do we put people on a low carbohydrate diet that's nutrient dense? We have them moderate their intake of fruit, and we focus on vegetables, nuts, seeds, and berries. In this study published in JAMA in 2004, low carbohydrate diets were shown to reduce C-reactive protein by 47%. That's very significant. This is an article by Matt Hershey. He's one of our presenters on Friday. One of the things I'd like to start introducing to you is that low carbohydrate diets produce many, many benefits. It's not simply weight reduction. When we consume less carbohydrate, our body naturally begins to break down fat, lipolysis, and form ketones. One of the ketones is called beta-hydroxybutyrate. Beta-hydroxybutyrate, as Matt Hershey told me in a phone conversation, is a metabolite that has numerous non-metabolic roles. So ketones can be used as a fuel source, but it's more than a fuel source. It changes gene expression, as you can see in this article, and it also stimulates mitochondrial function. So again, Friday is our big mitochondrial day. What you'll see in the diagrams that I have is that beta-hydroxybutyrate stimulates complexes 3 and 4 of the electron transport chain. So not only does a high glucose load impair mitochondrial function, eating less and therefore lipolysis and therefore ketogenesis and therefore endogenous production of beta-hydroxybutyrate actually stimulates more efficient ATP production in mitochondria. So what he shows here is that beta-hydroxybutyrate is a histone deacetylase inhibitor. What that means for you, which I believe I show on the next slide, is that that's associated with what we call a rejuvenative phenotype. So let me just connect those dots and then we'll keep making progress. But my point here is when people eat less, they make more beta-hydroxybutyrate. That changes gene expression into a pattern that we call a rejuvenative phenotype. Now, do we see that reflected in the research? Absolutely, because we know that low carbohydrate diets prolong life. This other study also used the nutritional supplement niacinamide to accomplish the same goal. So what if you had someone on a low carbohydrate diet and they were on nutritional supplements that included niacinamide? You would induce, according to the research, a rejuvenative phenotype. And there's clinical data to back that up. So here's another very important point. So we've talked now, I've already reinforced what I consider to be the diet of choice, paleo-Mediterranean diet. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, berries, lean sources of protein. A very important point to make and to remember and to even communicate this to your patients when it's appropriate is to tell them that when we change their diet, we're not simply changing nutrient intake. If nutrient intake was all that it was about, anybody could eat junk food and then take a multivitamin and come out equal. What we're trying to accomplish with a plant-based diet, in addition to the increased intake of phytonutrients, is we're trying to change their gastrointestinal microflora. So, as you can see on the slides, Hans and Franz say, hear me now, believe me later. When we change the diet, we change the microbes. When we change the gastrointestinal microbes, we change immune phenotype. So, as you can see in this study and several others, when patients, for example, with rheumatoid arthritis are placed on a plant-based diet, the patients who benefit from a plant-based diet are the patients who have beneficial changes in their microflora of their gastrointestinal bacteria. If the change simply resulted from nutrient intake, then all of the patients you'd expect them to more or less experience a similar benefit, right? Because nutrient intake remains constant across the group. But what differentiates those who respond to a plant-based diet from those who don't is changes in microflora. And that was shown a long time ago. And you've got a citation here. The same thing was shown here. This finding of an association between intestinal microflora and disease activity may have implications for helping us understand how diet can affect rheumatoid arthritis. So when we change the diet, we change the microbes. When we change the microbes, we change immune balance. That's why a plant-based diet is essential as the foundation for everything else we're going to talk about today and throughout the week. We have to start with a healthy foundation. Very interesting article. I'll just summarize the last sentence here. This was a 9-year prospective study showing that the amount of bacterial DNA in the blood predicted the onset of diabetes. And this is a study of about 3,000 people, I believe. 3,200. Very remarkable study. So the patients who have the highest level of bacterial DNA are the patients most likely to develop diabetes, adult onset diabetes, diabetes type 2, also known as insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, which we know has an inflammatory component. So I think we could reasonably say that bacterial load translates into systemic inflammation. Systemic inflammation in various pathways correlates with insulin resistance. Well, then the question we could ask, and this is a common theme you're going to hear a lot, and Jeff already introduced it, and that is the answers we're going to end up with start with the questions that we ask. And that was one of the quotes from Jeff's 1994 tape, which I showed earlier. So if this is true, we could ask, what's the biggest bacterial load in the body? What are our options? Nasopharynx, mouth, gastrointestinal tract, lungs, genitourinary tract, skin, environmental exposure. What's the biggest load of microbial debris that we're exposed to? Obviously gastrointestinal tract, right? About 3 to 4 pounds of bacteria. You don't have 3 to 4 pounds of bacteria in your nose and sinuses and mouth. So what I think this correlates with is small intestine bacterial overgrowth. If that were true, then we should expect to see antimicrobial interventions have effectiveness for insulin resistance, and we do have that data now. A lot of people have nutritional deficiencies, and if you don't believe me, you can always reference this article published by the American Medical Association. So, very important article, great article to have in your practice and put on your website at your discretion. Quotes from this article: most people do not consume an optimal amount of all vitamins by diet alone. It appears prudent for all adults, to take vitamin supplements. Finally, physicians should make specific efforts to ensure that patients are taking the vitamins they should. And here's the direct quote. Multivitamins do provide an anti-inflammatory benefit, as you can see from this clinical trial. So if we put people on a low-carb diet and we put people on multivitamins, we can reduce their inflammatory load. According to this article, we can do the same thing with vitamin D. So look at how we've already been able to, based on research, decipher and begin deconstructing this whole thing that we've been taught is chronic inflammation. Let's change our description of it from chronic inflammation to sustained inflammation, and then begin to identify and address each of those components. Well, vitamin D deficiency is very common, and it causes subclinical inflammation, sometimes clinical inflammation. So you can reduce C-reactive protein by 23%. So if we can reduce it 50% with diet, low-carbohydrate diet, 15% with nutritional supplementation, and an additional 23% with vitamin D supplementation, I think we're on our way to seeing some improvements clinically. The next few slides just give you mechanisms for vitamin D's action. I won't spend a lot of time on that. But I will ask you a question. Where do you see the greatest density of vitamin D receptors in the body? Bone, gut, brain? None of the above. It's actually in the immune system, in developing immune cells within the thymus. So you're going to see that vitamin D, and many of you, I'm sure, have read the article I published in 2004, which is a major monograph on this topic. Vitamin D does a lot more than just calcium homeostasis. As you can see from this animal research, vitamin D is also very important for maintaining mucosal integrity. So although, again, as I just said, this is an animal study, the implications of this study are that vitamin D deficiency causes leaky gut. That's what this research would suggest. So, another part of the plan, as I already mentioned, is combination fatty acid therapy. I've written some monographs on that, which you can download if fatty acids are new to you. Again, the fatty acids that we emphasize, ALA, GLA, EPA, and DHA, all have anti-inflammatory benefits through numerous mechanisms. So we try to use them all together. In that way, we're providing the best benefit, and we're providing an opportunity for synergism, because the fatty acids actually work better when they're provided in combination. Again, sorry, I'll go back to that one. You know, I have a whole lecture on combination fatty acid therapy that could last about 3 hours, and here I've had to just summarize it in one slide. But you can see we've got lots of mechanisms through which fatty acids have been shown to create their clinical results. But what ultimately are those clinical results? People are happier, they have less pain, and they live longer. Right? That's what happens when people consume combination fatty acids, or at the very least, fish oil. These are the most common allergens listed here from a really great article published in The Lancet in 1979. But we also have to take into account the fact that people can be allergic to anything, right? I had a patient several years ago. It was actually that psoriasis patient I started to mention a few minutes ago. Totally cleared her psoriasis in 1 month of treatment based on this protocol and a few modifications. But as it turns out for her, her major trigger for her psoriasis was, her major dietary trigger was chicken broth. So I think most of us would consider chicken broth to be a pretty healthy food, but certainly not for everybody. We've got a few minutes. I'm sure the coffee's warm and ready for you. We're going to go for about another 5 minutes, and then we'll take a break. Activation of Nf Kappa-B. This was new news many years ago, but now I think we all take it for granted that this is a major inflammatory pathway. And importantly for us, we can modulate that pathway with certain nutrients. Vitamin D, curcumin, which is best administered with piperine to enhance intestinal absorption, lipoic acid, green tea, rosemary, grapeseed extract, propolis, zinc, coenzyme Q10, selenium, indole-3-carbinol, N-acetylcysteine, resveratrol, GLA, EPA, boswellia, harpagophytum, and also isohumulones from hops should have been on that list as well. Melatonin could also be on that list. So we have many ways to modulate that pathway. So that actually brings us to the end of that. What I'm going to do right now in another 3 minutes or so is just introduce the idea of the importance of genetically modified foods, and then we'll all be ready for a break. So as you all know, on Friday we have a guest lunch presentation by Jeffrey Smith who's going to talk about genetically modified foods. Well, I looked up this research just because I wanted to see what was out there in the literature and to kind of form my own opinion. So we'll go through 5 articles. Pesticides associated with genetically modified foods are absorbed and are retained by humans. So one of the arguments in favor of allowing genetically modified foods to be on the market is that, well, the toxins break down or they're not absorbed, things like that. Those are the arguments in favor of genetically modified foods, but it's not true. And this article proves it. This was published in Reproductive Toxicology in 2011. So humans do absorb, accumulate, retain pesticides and toxins associated with genetically modified foods. In this study of farm workers, what was found is when they were exposed to genetically modified foods, they developed more allergic responses. Immediate hypersensitivity induced by bacteria and transgenic foods. Here's a very important animal study which compared the effect of genetically modified corn to wild-type natural corn. What was shown in this study, and I'll show you a diagram in just a moment, what was shown in this study is an almost doubling of a cell population called gamma delta T cells. So we're going to talk about various different immune phenotypes as we go through the course of mostly today. One of these cells responsible for the allergic and autoimmune phenotype that we see in our clinical practices is, people don't talk about it very much, but they're called gamma delta T cells. They correlate with autoimmunity and allergic disease like asthma. Both of which, autoimmune diseases, the incidence of autoimmune diseases are skyrocketing. And the incidence of allergic diseases are skyrocketing. And furthermore, our conceptual differentiation of allergy from autoimmunity is factitious. Most people who are allergic have an autoimmune component. Most people who are autoimmune have an allergic component. So rather than seeing those as distinct, we need to overlap them like a Venn diagram. One of the common themes in allergy and autoimmunity are these gamma delta T cells, which according to this animal study, the population of gamma delta T cells, as you can see in this diagram, was doubled, not by eating corn per se, but by eating genetically modified corn. Finally, this very famous study by Seralini female rats fed with genetically modified foods and monitored for an appropriate duration of time, not simply 60 days, developed tumors and tissue necrosis. So that's the F of the FIND SET acronym. That takes us to our coffee break, which I'm sure we all well deserve right now. And we're going to rest and refuel for about 20 minutes, and then I hope to see you back in here after that.